Hi folks, it is Monday the 29th of June 2020 and we're in day 11 of our Liberty Vigil. I'm feeling kind of casual about today and kind of tired because it's been a while of doing this every day, but I think it's important that we talk a little bit today about the creeping violence that is going on and project out ahead to how we might think about it and what we might do to prepare for the trend that appears to be opening up in our culture. I want to start with a little bit of a summary, specifically of the events in the CHAZ CHOP. It's the beginning of week 4 of the autonomous zone or the something or other protest zone in the Capitol Hill downtown area of Seattle, Washington, here in the not so United States of America. A couple of days after the BLM takeover of the CHAZ, Washington State Governor Jay Inslee publicly denied knowing about it, which was a little mystifying. And the Seattle mayor, Jenny Durkan, once the firebombing and extortion began, started to muse about the summer of love that we might be in for down at the 24/7 neighborhood block. The police, free CHAZ turned CHOP, racked up a fatality, age 19, and a critical shooting injury, age 17, over last weekend, which brought a little bit of a shift in the mayor's tone and in the festival atmosphere down in the CHAZ. And that shift in tone might have been encouraged a little bit also by the threat of several businesses and residents to sue the city in relation to the mayor's failure to actually protect them. She was apparently the one who had initially ordered the police department to abandon the precinct office that stands within the boundaries of the CHAZ. After the weekend's events, Mayor Durkan asked the CHAZ CHOP squatters to vacate the location, in response to which one splinter group took up residence in a second part of the city, more outlying, and those that remained doubled the running casualty count this morning before dawn, with 2 more critical shooting injuries, one of whom, as I understand it, has died this afternoon. Our thoughts and prayers go out, obviously, to the victims and their families, and also everyone else who's being affected by this craziness. It's really tragic that it has happened at all, and obviously that it's gone on so long and with so little support for ending that and bringing the situation under control. So it looks like things are still going to continue to escalate and continue to be out of control, and that there's not going to be any sense of lawfulness or order stepping in to make sense of what's going on there. And I don't think that the no police approach is working out very well, which I don't think comes as a surprise to anyone who has adult information about the world. So I don't think that we're really shocked, but I think when we look around to see how that is beginning to expand and how it's beginning to spread into the world beyond, I think that's the part that has been, if not surprising, at least not entirely predictable. I think, at least for me, I've been waiting to see what direction this was going to go in, and it's been unnerving. When the mayor came down and said, okay, everybody go home, I thought, I don't think they're going home. But certainly at other times, we've had protests that lasted a week, and then everybody got tired and went home, went back to work, and got on with their lives. So it wasn't entirely unreasonable to wait a few days to see how things would play out. But like I said, this is week 4, and she's made a call for people to go home, and they're not doing it. So it's reasonable to think that we are not headed for an easy resolution. It was obvious a long time ago we weren't headed for a quick resolution. And now I think the ease of the resolution has also come into question and raises a lot of really serious alarm bells. I think it's pretty clear that Seattle's not the only place that there's been unrest. It's the only place where there's been this formalized uprising so far, although there was an attempt in Washington, D.C. With the Black House Autonomous Zone I think it was over a week ago now that they attempted that, and that did not get traction. Thank goodness, because it was in the nation's capital. I would have been more disturbed even if that had been able to gain a foothold. But it was disturbing nonetheless, and that kind of ushered in this era in the last couple of weeks of the overturning of the statues. And the fact of the matter is, if this violence continues in places like Seattle, DC, Minneapolis, Atlanta, and now as of last night spreading even more extensively in St. Louis, and we've had lower level protests in other places as well, there are going to be people who leave. A lot of people aren't able to leave, and they're going to be stuck. They're going to be victimized by violence. But for the people that are able to leave, or who will, their standard of expectation of whether they're able to leave or not will change. As they become weary of violence or they become subject to more immediate violence, their threshold's going to drop, and they're going to say, I am out of here. I don't care if I lose all of my savings or if I lose my house. I'm just going to. So we're going to end up in a situation, barring a turnaround, where we have refugees from state to state. And it reminds me of the reality we already have in Colorado of marijuana refugees. And of course, there's always the phenomenon of people that just like to smoke pot and they flock to Colorado to smoke pot. I'm not talking about that crowd. As someone who lives with a disability and does alternate health care, I'm very aware of and very much in touch with folks who live with really profound disability, many of whom, because of their disability, live with a very high degree of poverty, do not have traditional health care, and often turn to alternative health care approaches to manage pain. And one of the things that they can do is use marijuana. And so there are a lot of people that have gathered since legalization in Colorado as basically marijuana refugees. And they use a lot of marijuana in a lot of different forms, from vaping to edibles, etc., just to manage really, really severe pain. And so it's interesting to see the dynamics that there are in those refugee communities. And it will be interesting to see the similarities and differences that will emerge as people come fleeing violence, because there are a lot of similarities. There are people that will be impoverished. They will probably have pain of different kinds, emotional pain, spiritual angst, as they are leaving violent situations. Many of them will be estranged from their families if they're leaving a place that was their home. Some of them will be leaving to go live with their families for the first time in a long time, if they're leaving a city to come home to a home in the country or in another state. And so we'll see a lot of changes in place and changes in family dynamics. But I think one of the interesting aspects of this will be that people are going to be leaving predominantly blue areas to come to predominantly red areas, whether that's people leaving from the city to go to the suburbs in their own area, or leaving an overall high population density part of their state for a much more rural part of their state, or leaving an overall blue state to come to a different state entirely, in a red state. And that's going to produce incredible culture shifts in our country, which is going to cause another whole round of discontent. I am praying it won't cause violence, and I think we need to look for ways to prevent that from creating situations that are ripe for violence. I know there's already been a lot of cultural shifts from migration, as Californians have had an influence on both Colorado and Texas. My family's from Colorado, so I've really watched that happen in Colorado over decades. I know in Texas it's really been intensified over a matter of years, and that's been very problematic there. I know it has certainly also been problematic in Colorado, between sort of the Boulder, Denver metroplex, as it's becoming, and then the rural farmers and other rural people out in the rest of Colorado. But in that situation, there's a lot of distance, physical distance, that separates that metro area from the rest of the state because it's a large place. It's spread out. There's plenty of elbow room, as they say. And we don't have that in every situation. Here in Ohio, we have 3 true metropolis cities, Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati. Not more than 2.5 hours separates each of them from the other. Far less than 5 hours by car separates the 2 that are the farthest apart. And we have at least 4 other mid-sized cities sprinkled around in the interior of the state of Ohio. And everything that's in between them is rural. Some of it is incredibly rural, Appalachian, remote even. So we have a really wide, a really disparate population distribution and a lot of cultural variety in our state. And so when I look down the road at a population redistribution and the potential for friction, cultural friction, and even edging up to violence, I'm very concerned about it. In the last administration, President Obama talked frequently about having a purple country. If I recall correctly, even George Bush, and in that era, there was a lot of talk about kind of this blended approach that we were trying to take to our culture. It was never true. I don't know how much of the talk about that was disingenuous and how much was just mistaken. But it's clearly not the case. People are tribal. We have freedom of association for a reason, because in certain areas of our life, it's helpful for us, and we like to be around people with whom we have similarities, share similar values. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. We need to maintain the civility to allow us to be able to get along with people who are different. We can't afford to be isolated and suspicious and hateful. But there's nothing wrong with spending time with people that are like us inherently. But over the last century, we've gone from being just having some degree of wanting to associate with others like us to being intensely tribal. For a lot of reasons that are, I think, very problematic. In the early part of the 20th century, we embarked on this progressive arc. We've eviscerated education and its integrity. We've really lowered our capacity for critical thinking. By the end of the century, we were in transition at the end of the Cold War, and we entered into this sort of postmodern development era that lasted really from the end of the 1980s through the beginning of the war on terrorism, where we really decided that our own perceptions were going to rule over a third-party perspective, an external reality, an objective reality. Our hubris climbed and our humility diminished. And that has landed us squarely in the heart of the 21st century and our ubiquitous technocracy. We really do have the rule of technology and the way that it's been welcomed completely uncritically into every corner of our lives. We have a lower frustration tolerance. We've totally diminished our ability to delay gratification. As one very wise friend says to me, to say no to ourselves. We're not able to say no to ourselves well, and we need to relearn that ability. We've seen an increase in neurological scrambling, both in our children as they're born with neurological disorder, and also in those of us that are older, who are having our wiring scrambled by the good news, bad news of brain plasticity. And we're experiencing incredibly toxic effects from overload, sensory overload, neurological overload, and I think emotional overload and spiritual poverty. All of these things combine to diminish not our humanity. Nothing can diminish our actual humanity. We are created, whether we think we are or not, in the image of God. And we will always be His creatures. But our meaningful access to that reality has been diminished dramatically over the last century, and particularly over the last 30 to 50 years. And that is really keeping us from being able to come together and be a purple country. At one time, America was described as a melting pot. Our ability to blend and to share one another's lives was really noticeable. We really stood out in the world as being able to do that. And while I think it is still true that we're the least racist country on the globe, we're not the most racist country on the globe, we really have suffered in our ability to be empathic with one another's experiences, and to really be connected in a way that keeps us from lashing out at one another and from edging up toward violence and crossing over the boundary that our strong attachments afford us. They give us a buffer between our natural tribal instinct toward violence and the more softening effects of civilization, which we really need to remain intact. Rather than having a melting pot, we're more like a chef's salad on our best days. And on our worst days, which we've been experiencing lately, we're a lot more like that sort of olfactory cacophony, that kind of assaultive pile of smells that you get when you walk these days into a college cafeteria, right? Everybody has to have the option of everything on every day, and when you walk in, you smell all of it at once, and it's just absolutely nauseating. And so I think that as we go into a situation where the different ideological factions are coming up against each other, when people are fleeing violence and moving from one place to another, when we combine that with our diminished access to empathy for one another, we are going to have a lot of difficulties as this unrest spills out of cities into suburbs, suburbs into surrounding rural areas, and across the boundaries of states. I think we need to really focus on what we're going to be doing about that going forward. I think we need to really take a step back, think very critically about what our personal non-negotiables are in terms of our own lifestyle, and what we really must have in the communities that we live in, what we're willing to defend, and what we're not willing to allow to come into our communities in terms of our value system, and also the ways that we want to reach out and shelter people who are fleeing violence. Because at least from my perspective, I want to shelter people, and I want to give them the option of being safer and having a place to be if they need to be out of harm's way. But I'm absolutely unwilling to allow them to come in from another more chaotic situation and bring the patterns that they created or they allowed to be created in the place they lived before. I've chosen to live where I live because I like it, and I want it to stay the way that it is. If I wanted it to be different, I would live somewhere else. And so I think that we need to think that through. I want to invite everybody to really spend some time thinking about that. If you're prayer inclined, to be praying about that, because we need to stay away from violence, and we also need to preserve the values that we hold dear, because that is what having a constitutional republic is about. Thank you for joining me, and I welcome your comments. And obviously, if you appreciate this content, hit the like button, subscribe to it, and if you hit the bell, hopefully YouTube will notify you when more content is out here, when videos are available. This Liberty Vigil is meant to go through the 4th of July, at which time I'll be looking at another project. I have several different things in the works, including an interesting t-shirt design that I love. I finally got the artwork back today after a week, which isn't very long, but I was anxiously waiting. And so I will be putting that out hopefully within the next week or so, and letting folks know if they're interested in purchasing those, both to help support the channel and this effort, and to get our conversation going, and as a way of letting our presence be known as people who are committed to the value of everyone's life in our republic, but also to actually speaking life back into our communities. So everybody take care, have a great week, and hopefully I will see you again tomorrow. Thank you. God bless.